This is our next to the last class. The last class will be reserved exclusively for general discussion of the pervasive ideas in the course that you prefer to discuss. But I will begin that discussion by saying something about the vexed question of identity politics that I know is of interest to some of you. So please come prepared in the next class to discuss your general concerns, questions, and proposals. Today's class, the next to the last then, is devoted to ideas, to the general ideas about society and its transformation and the conception of the ideal that envelop these programmatic arguments. And in particular, I want to discuss three sets of ideas. So first, returning to the theme of the very last part of last week's class, ideas about structure. I devoted most of the class to a criticism of the historical context of the large ideas that now inform our programmatic convictions. And at the very end, I turn to the implications of this critique for the conception of structure. And that's the first theme that I want to develop in today's class. Second are ideas about agency, how we are to understand the relation between substantive programmatic proposals and the political and class alliances that can implement them. The ideas about agency have the most intimate relation to the ideas about structure. They could be seen as a direct implication of those earlier ideas. And the third set of ideas has to do with the ideal, the normative direction of the argument, and the conception of humanity underlying it. And therefore also how we should now understand and reshape our view of what distinguishes the left from the right. That's the agenda of today's class, which I must develop in a very schematic form. The larger challenge that prompts the discussion is this. There is no programmatic argument of consequence that fails to rely on general ideas about society, history, and humanity. But these ideas need not, and ordinarily do not, take the form of comprehensive and systematic social theories. So the import of my critique from last week is that the ideas that are supplied to us, on one hand by the contemporary social sciences, and on the other hand by the history of classical European social theory, especially Marxism, are inadequate for the task before us. But what are we to do? Are we to await the arrival of similarly ambitious projects, a new Marx, a new Hegel? It seems that we should understand comprehensive and systematic social theory as only the limiting case of a much broader range of explanatory and programmatic practices. These practices do depend on ideas, but the ideas need not take the form of comprehensive and systematic theory. And so that is the spirit in which I'm trying to conduct today's discussion as I did last week's. A way of thinking rather than a theoretical system. Nothing against theoretical systems. We should not deride them. But they should not be the standard, much less the exclusive form of our understanding. Now then, first, structure. The transformation of the structure of the formative institutional arrangements and ideological assumptions of a society is the supreme object of both theoretical ambition and practical concern in thought and in politics. In every historical circumstance, we can distinguish the surface of routines and repetitious conflicts from the deep structure of the arrangements and routines that give the arrangements and assumptions that give shape to those routines and to those conflicts. So how do we know that an intervention in history, in society, represents a change of the structure? We know because its effect is to transform those surface routines and conflicts. And in particular, the contests that have to do with the mastery and use of the political, economic, and cultural resources by which we create the future within the present. That's the criterion for structural change. And structural change, I argued last week, and have assumed throughout the course, is ordinarily fragmentary rather than systemic, but can nevertheless become radical in its outcome if it persists in a certain direction under a particular conception. So on this view, for example, Keynesianism, understood as a set of ideas about political economy and as a set of practices in the counter-cyclical management of the economy by fiscal and economic policy, was an example of what you could call radical reform. That is to say, intervention in some aspect of the formative institutional and ideological structure of the advanced industrial democracies in the 20th century. Before Keynesianism, there was the gold standard. The gold standard tied the hands of national governments. And as the Marxist economist Kalecki observed, made the level of economic activity depend strictly and immediately on the level of business confidence. Keynesianism loosened these restraints and gave shape to what subsequently became the so-called political economic cycle, the business cycle, as we now know it. So it wasn't the substitution of some abstract system like capitalism by another system, socialism, or the market economy by a command economy. But it was nevertheless structural because it changed those routines, those recurrent conflicts about the creation of the future within the present. And that's the stuff of real structural change in history. Now, on this view, then, Structure is not system. The regimes, the institutional and ideological regimes that give shape to these surface conflicts and routines are not indivisible systems that are there on a take it or leave it basis. As the narrowest version of Marxist theory presupposes. The elements that compose them, institutional and ideological, do have many connections and reinforce one another. But they can be and are pulled apart separately and replaced separately. So this view of structure, not system, stands by opposition to what I called last week the binary view of politics. The binary view of politics is the thesis that there are basically two kinds of politics. There's the reformist management of a system, and there is the revolutionary substitution of one system by another. And the claim here is that this binary view excludes or disregards what is in fact the predominant form of structural change in history, what I'm calling radical reform. A transformation of elements of the structure that is piecemeal, but nevertheless has decisive consequences for the surface, and that is capable of having a sequel. That's, I'm arguing, what structural change is really like in history. Now, furthermore, we need to say more about the sense in which these structures exist. They don't exist in the same way that natural phenomena exist. They're not like the atomic structure of a physical object. And the fundamental reason was the reason stated by Giambattista Vico in the 18th century, before the development of classical European social theory. He said, we can know these structures because we made them. So of them, we have the knowledge that the Creator has of his creation. A kind of knowledge that we cannot hope to have from outside of natural phenomena. But the problem is that although these structures are our creation, they are artifacts, they are kind of frozen fighting, the residues of our practical and visionary conflicts, they can be so established practically and conceptually that they present themselves to us as if they were natural phenomena, disguising their true nature as our creations. So these structures that we form, these institutional and ideological structures, can be established in ways that insulate them against challenge and change. That make it hard to revise them, and that represent them as if they were natural or necessary. And to that extent, and in that way, they assume the mendacious semblance of natural phenomena and present themselves to us as if they were an alien fate. In another direction, these structures can be disentrenched. So what I mean by entrenchment is this insulation against challenge and change. And disentrenchment is the opposite. Disentrenchment is when the institutional and ideological structure is arranged in a way that invites its own revision in the light of experience. To the extent that it invites its own revision, it deroves itself. It casts down this false semblance of naturalness and necessity. And it diminishes the distance between the ordinary moves that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted and that are even invisible to us, and the extraordinary moves by which from time to time, under the pressure of crisis, we challenge and change part of this framework. And then, to the extent that this character of the structure changes, we can engage in the structure without surrendering to it. We can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. And that is one of the most fundamental forms of freedom and of power. If we have to choose between isolation and surrender, we are not free. We are free only to the extent that we can engage, but in engaging, continue resisting. Then we are free. So this is a form of power, and one of our greatest interests. And this interest is a presupposition of many of the programmatic arguments here, is that this interest in changing the quality and not simply the content of the structures is intimately related to many of our most fundamental other moral and material interests. It is intimately related to our material interest in the development of our practical powers, including our practical powers of production. So, for example, the standard economic conception of rationality, freedom, is freedom to recombine the factors of production. But within an institutional framework of production and exchange that is taken for granted. A greater freedom is the freedom to recombine not only the factors of production, but the elements that compose the institutional framework of production and exchange. So that this transformation of the framework arises continuously or naturally as an extension of that first order freedom. Similarly, this freedom to not take for granted is intimately connected to our moral interest in the liquefaction of entrenched schemes of social division and hierarchy that hold us hostage in our relations to one another. Every scheme of social division of hierarchy, every hierarchy of caste or of class depends on the stability and even the sanctity of a set of institutional and ideological arrangements. If those arrangements can be, and assumptions, can be contested at every turn, and contested as part of the extension of the normal business of life, the scheme of social division and hierarchy will not be stable. So one of the many ways in which the programmatic arguments here have differed from the standard programmatic arguments of the left in the past is that they relentlessly exploit this connection between the interest in disentrenchment or experimentalism and this world of material and moral interest that we have. So, for example, the deepened and disseminated knowledge economy is an experimentalist reconstruction of the market order that treats as open to contest and revision what market fundamentalism takes for granted. And similarly, a high-energy democracy is a form of political life that understands transformative and democratic politics as a practice that disentrenches the structure, not in a one-time operation, but in an ongoing fashion. So it's not just the substitution of one structure for another. It's a change in the character or quality of the structures. Now, another way to explain the distinctive element in this idea of the structures as being variable in their quality as well as their content is by contrast to a romantic preconception. The romantic preconception is the conception is that there is an antinomy, a contradiction between human life in its purest form, spirit, and structure. On that romantic view, structure is the hand of Midas, chilling and killing the spirit. So it's the contrast between the mob in the street and the bureaucratic apparatus of the state and of the law, or of romantic love, in contrast to the routines of married life. And the romantic idea is a form of despair, because what it says, in effect, is that we can shape these structures from time to time in certain conditions, and then there will be these interludes of pure existence, of authenticity. But they will reestablish themselves. They are inevitable. And so all we have are these interludes where we can be really us. But we can't fundamentally change the relation between spirit and structure. That's the romantic idea. As opposed to the thesis underlying these programmatic arguments, that we can aspire not just to replace one structure by another, but to change the relation of spirit to structure. That's a higher order of ambition. Now, furthermore, contrary to what is the predominant criticism of classical European social theories, such as Marxism, the emphasis here is not on the rejection of the functional element in explanation. So remember, a functional explanation is an explanation that treats the consequence as the cause. So Darwinian natural selection is an example of functional explanation. So in Marx's system, the ability of a mode of production, an emergent or new mode of production, capitalism in relation to feudalism, and then socialism in relation to capitalism, to develop the forces of production to the maximal extent, becomes then the cause of its triumph and propagation. And for the consequence to become the cause in a functional explanation, there always has to be some mechanism that transforms the consequence into a cause, that gives it causal potency. In Marx's system, it's the way in which, in the organization of class conflict, the interests of a rising class become associated with the universal interests of humanity in the maximum development of the forces of production in a particular historical circumstance. Now, it seems clear to me that there is an undeniable element of functional explanation in history. The problem is not the functional element. It is true that some regimes have more functional advantages than others in a given circumstance. The problem is the association of the functional element with those deep structural illusions, that there's a limited menu of regimes, that each of them is an indivisible system, that there are laws governing their foreordained succession in history. What actually happens is that any given functional advantage, the ability to exploit, for example, a new set of organizational and technological innovations, sure. The ability to exploit a new set of functional and technological innovations can take different institutional forms. There's never just one way. There's never just a way to satisfy a series of functional requirements. They can always be satisfied by different forms of organization. So this fact, let's call it functional indeterminacy. This is a very important element. For example, the knowledge economy that we discussed here, and the technological and organizational innovations that compose it, can be established in different ways. Some of them exploiting the opportunities of the knowledge economy more than other ways. And this idea of functional indeterminacy is closely related to another conception that has been important in the arguments here. It's the conception of the path of least resistance and the alternatives to the path of least resistance. So there's a set of innovations. And the tendency in history is for those innovations to be received and established in the form that least disturbs the ruling interests and the dominant beliefs. That's what I'm calling the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance is always the most probable outcome, but it is never the only or necessary outcome. There's always an alternative to the path of least resistance. See, the example of the knowledge economy. The insular form of the knowledge economy is a characteristic outcome of the path of least resistance. But there's an alternative to it. In the contest between the path of least resistance and the alternative is the object of transformative thought in politics. The path of least resistance has an advantage. Its advantage is that it is tangible, that it requires less transformation. But it has a disadvantage, which gives the opportunity to its enemies. And the disadvantage is that characteristically, it taps the potential, including the functional potential of the innovations less than the alternatives would. So a deepened and disseminated form of the knowledge economy would allow a more sustained and radical rise in productivity, for example, as well as diminishing inequality. That's the advantage that the enemies of the path of least resistance have. So notice the following. These ideas about structure are very abstract, to be sure. But they come together to compose the rudiments of a way of thinking. And here's the paradox that you have to understand. If we want a way of thinking not to have to take just the exclusive and anomalous form of a comprehensive and systematic theory, like Marx's theory of society and history, we have to be willing to trade in abstractions. Because otherwise we can't form a way of thinking. So paradoxically, these abstractions that compose the way of thinking liberate us from the need to rely on a dogmatic, comprehensive, and systematic theory, because they don't have to take that form. But they do guide our approach to the explanation and to the proposals. And that's their great importance. Now, this is very difficult psychologically, I understand. Because those who are interested in the transformation of the world are ordinarily intellectually impatient. But what can we do? This is the reality. And we have to combine somehow practical and theoretical ambition. A very hard combination. A very hard combination for a reason that Hegel remarked when he said that the only remaining tragedy in the bourgeois world is the impossibility of combining a life of thought with a life of action. He was exaggerating and giving an inadequate role to the inadequate place to the role of luck and of deliberation, because we cannot combine these two activities at the same time. But with luck and with intention, we can combine them in phases of withdrawal and engagement, and through the division of labor within humanity. So we could say that these are philosophy and politics are the two activities most completely worthy of a human being. Philosophy in the sense of the mind at war, insisting on its prerogative to deal with what matters most. And politics in the sense of transformative politics. The reason is that these are the only two activities that are about everything, rather than about something in particular. And in addition to being about everything, they demand everything. A complete mobilization of the emotions and of experience. And in this sense, they are difficult to combine precisely because they're so similar and have a parallel structure. But this is the spirit in which we must conduct this effort on this view. So that's the first set of ideas. I know, hard to discuss, but intimately related to all of the arguments of the course. And I'm happy to engage in any aspect of this or clarify some part of these claims and assumptions. Yes?
I want to bring two historical cases into the discussion, maybe contextualize
Yes.
your arguments. We tend to perceive the French Revolution and the October Revolution in Moscow as two moments in time. The storm into the Winter Palace, this moment that symbolizes the end of one regime and
Yes.
Transition to another.
Yes.
And the moment in which the head of Louis falls. Now, these two moments are not the moments that really reflect the magnitude and the dynamic nature
Yes.
of these two historical moments, because it took much more than this for this revolution to take place. It was persisting structural changes that constitute this moment of revolution.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, we perceive them as one moment. And I'm wondering, how can we achieve the structural change?
What do you mean it's one moment? You mean each of them as one moment?
Yes, we speak about the Russian Revolution,
Yes.
this moment in time, this specific month in which the Bolsheviks managed to
Yes.
to achieve this revolution. And I'm wondering, how can we achieve this structural change in which you're advocating for if we don't have a very intense and strong symbolism in which people can reflect and motivate and persist on this structural change?
So there are a series of confusions, right, of combinations that complicate this. This is a very important question that you raised. So take your example of the French Revolution. Perhaps the greatest work on the French Revolution is Tocqueville's book on the Ancien Régime and the French Revolution. A major theme of that book is how similar France after the Revolution was to France before the Revolution. There were changes, but the changes were relative. And the self-presentation of the revolution as a complete regeneration of society was a fiction on this view. And the same thing can be said and has been said often about the Russian Revolution. Then there's another element, which is the relation of violence, revolutionary violence, political conflict, to the notion of total change. So within the framework of this intellectual tradition in which we have this binary view of politics, and we imagine it's either reformist or revolutionary. Violence, revolutionary violence, then connotes, is connected with this idea of total change. Now, Hegel, in the Phenomenology of Mind, in his chapter on the French Revolution, had the opposite thesis. That is, he says, revolutionary violence, the terror in the French Revolution, arose as a response to the failure to achieve structural change. So the difficulty of achieving structural change then elicits this violence, the terror, which is an attempt to force through some kind of shortcut the structural change that cannot be generated through some transformation of the arrangements and the assumptions, as if there were a shortcut. And the shortcut invariably produces counterintuitive consequences, involuntary effects. So somehow we have to free ourselves from all of those illusions. But there's still the problem, which your question elicits when you refer to the symbolic marking of the transformation, which I associated with the idea of a prophetic direction. There has to be a direction. The direction has to be represented. And everything that's done in the historical present on this view has to be represented as a down payment on this direction. And this is what is immensely powerful in the discourse and practice of transformative politics, that we combine the practical with the prophetic. So we give a tangible down payment, which has two functions. One function is to be an initial step that has a possible sequel continuing in that direction, but the other function is to be, as you say, a symbol, a way of explaining what is the direction in which we're going. You have to give some tangible manifestation of it. So it's not the idea that there's a sudden systemic change, because there isn't, and violence won't do it. But some initial measures are more potent and expressive than others in preparing the sequel on one hand, and in representing the direction on the other. And those two things have to be combined. That is, there has to be the idea of a causal sequence. How do you get from there to here? You have to begin. There has to be a plausible sequence of steps. And the plausible sequence of steps can't be just instrumentally useful. It has to be able to explain or symbolize the direction. That's how I would answer. And the problem is that given our history, the history of political ideas, those requirements are mixed up with these other notions. They are false. The binary view of politics, the shortcut of violence, and so on and so forth. And somehow we have to disentangle this. And that's a practical task, but it's also a task in the realm of ideas. That's how I would begin to answer your question. But it's very confusing. And it's part of this tremendous background that we face, in which, as I said at the beginning of the course, the idea of revolution, the fantastical idea that there's a sudden transformation, in practice has very often become an alibi for its opposite. This is what really happens. So the leftists, the ex-leftist thinks, oh, that's what would really be change. It's not possible. If it's possible, it's too dangerous. So what's left to do? What's left to do is to humanize the world. And so the idea of revolution, this idea of violence, instantaneous change, total change, is turned upside down and becomes then a pretext for the humanization effort. That's what really happens. And so we have to face that and criticize our conceptions so that we don't become vulnerable to that. Because otherwise, it's really just a monstrous form of self-deception, in which the myth of revolution is serving as a preliminary to this resignation, as it ordinarily does. And so you could say, in a way, that this is less a rejection of the idea of revolution than it is an attempt to reinvent the idea of revolution. So it doesn't depend on these illusions. And it's a very tall order, very difficult. Very difficult practically, intellectually, spiritually. Because it depends on this recombination, in which we shuffle the cards. We're accustomed to associate the fragmentary and the gradual and the piecemeal with the superficial, and the profound with the systemic, the totalistic, the instantaneous. But that's not what the world is like. So we have to be able to recombine these elements. And in addition to all of the practical political problems and the intellectual confusions, there's psychological difficulty of someone being a visionary, willing to deal with the resistant character of the practical world, which allows itself to be changed only in pieces. And he says, no, now. And this is associated with this tremendous contrast between historical time and biographical time. So these collective projects advance when they advance in historical time, not in the dimension of our lives. And the individual agent, especially if he's a revolutionary and a visionary, says, no, I want it now in my life, not when I'm dead. But the world doesn't care about that. And so there's this antinomy. So I think the great discipline is the discipline of facing reality, not as an accommodation, but as something that would make you deeper and bigger. This is what's so tremendous about these experiences of engagement, that they could lead to resignation, to accommodation, to the identification of realism with myopia, or they could lead to the opposite, that you free yourself from these 19th century illusions, and then you're revolutionary idea becomes more profound and more ambitious, rather than being more restricted and more shallow. And so that's morally or spiritually the dilemma before each of us. That's how I would see it. Yes.
So
Yes, yes,
continue with that.
yes.
What are characteristics or elements that would make this kind of tangible down payment more or less successful in pointing to paving the pathway towards prophetic vision? It seems like, as you're describing, we could use abstractions to talk about some direction we should go in. As soon as you try to have any concrete implementation, you immediately fall back into get bound up in all the issues that you've been talking about.
Absolutely. So there are always these two aspects, right? So first of all, so I'm trying to distinguish, although they are connected, the aspect of causal sequence. You have to have a direction, and you have to select the first steps by which to begin to move in that direction. So the question is, how do you get there from here? And so now each step has this ambiguity. This is the nature of transformation. Each fragmentary step that you take could, on one side, be seen as a provocation and an opportunity to take the next step, or it could be seen as a way of not taking the next step. That is, you give a little bit so you don't give more. Or you take one step so you can take the next step. That is the permanent ambiguity in transformation. There's no way to get out of that. And so in a real experience of transformation, the meaning of a certain step always depends on what comes next. And so you have to choose in the context, according to circumstance, where you see the greatest causal potency, the greatest potential for the next steps. So that's what I'm calling the sequential element. But then there's the other element, which is the symbolic or ideational element. It's not just a set of tactics, of strategies. It's the question of how you explain. And before you can explain to others, you have to explain to yourself. So the transformation, the piecemeal transformation, these initial steps, have to be represented as in a way that renders immediate and intelligible in the light of experiences people already have, something bigger that could come afterwards. So you touch the wound, and then you believe because you touch the wound, and you see what the potential is. And those two elements have to be combined. Tactics, strategy by itself doesn't work. It's a mistake that the politicians often make, including leftist politicians. This pretense of hiding the plan that they don't have for tactical reasons. And you know what human life is really like. A couple of tactics and you're dead. So it claims to be realistic, but it's not realistic. So this is not, we're dealing here with these philosophical and social theoretical questions as the setting of these programmatic arguments. But what I'm trying to do is not to pull any punches. I'm trying to represent the situation as I think it really is. And as it really is, it's much more promising and interesting than all these fantasies that we've inherited from the history of these ideologies and social theories. So let's, yes. Yeah, yes.
I guess my question is, how would you know if you're wrong? How would you know if it is in fact the case that there is in fact like just a natural form in which societies and governments are going to take over time, and that this project is kind of doomed from the outset because it is like fundamentally incompatible in some vague sense.
Well, you know, of course, you know the way you know anything about society history. You know it backward and forward. That is, you know from historical experience and the controversies about historical experience. So, and then you know it forward through transformative practice and your experience, your experiments. And everything that you can say, both backward and forward, will remain contestable and the object of controversy. But take a typical extreme example of this, which we've discussed here, which was market fundamentalism in economics. So, as in Hayek. So it's the idea, the market has a single natural and necessary form. Robinson Crusoe trades on his island long enough, he reinvents the whole system of 19th century German private law. That was the idea. But there's enough legal and institutional variation in history to show that the idea is false. And that market orders in history have taken very different forms. Those forms can then be regarded as a subset of a larger range of variation. And that's what I'm calling the looking forward, the forward-looking thing. Then you have what's happened in the history of thought. So legal thought from 1850 to 1950 started out with the project of demonstrating in classical legal science that the market has a single natural and necessary form. That if you start with the abstractions about property and contract, you will generate succeeding levels of detailed legal and institutional arrangements that will vindicate this notion. The idea is the market order has a built-in package, a legal institutional architecture, which it was the project of classical legal science to reveal. And that was supposed to be an impersonal order of coordination among free and equal economic agents, free and equal agents, with no distributive consequences. So that's what classical legal science set out to reveal. It showed the opposite, against its own intention. So what happened with each succeeding generation is that they discovered the opposite. They discovered that each level down to concreteness in the definition of the concrete legal arrangements in any part of private law, there were choices. And that you couldn't resolve these choices by inferring the answer back from the abstract conception of the market. They were choices, they were conflicts of interest and conflicts of vision that couldn't be settled by inference to the abstract idea of the market. So if you look ahead, just taking the example of the history of American legal thought, to a figure like Oliver Wendell Holmes, he was far from a revolutionary. He was in many ways a conservative. But he represents a late stage in this disillusioned idea that the jurists came to against their will, against their intention, that the market order has no single natural and necessary form. And that was his main idea, that there are these conflicts of interest and vision that determine then how you deal with the crossroads at each level down of concreteness. So that's just enough, there are this long list of ways in which you would come to disbelieve in the idea that there's a single form. And there's history, like on this question of functional indeterminacy. So there's a technological innovation. Now it's the innovations of the knowledge economy. Before it was mechanized manufacturing. And you discover that there isn't one way of meeting those functional requirements. There are different ways. And some ways have advantages over other ways. So I gave before the example of the development of modern artillery in the late 18th century. The European autocratic, aristocratic states couldn't exploit the operational flexibility required by the full use of the new artillery because they had armies of conscript peasants who would run away. So they had to be put in compact formations. And the armies of revolutionary France could exploit these more because they could count on operational flexibility not degenerating into flight. So it's experience. So that's a basic answer to your question of how you discover that it's not true that there's just one form of achieving the functional advantages.
That only shows that there's only theoretically more than one form.
No, in historical experience, there have been alternative forms. In alternative forms, different mechanized manufacturing was adapted in Britain, in Japan, in Germany, then in Soviet Russia, then in communist China, under different institutional arrangements. And some were more successful than others, but there's no simple one-to-one relation. There isn't this simple idea that Marx believed in and that the conservative economists also believed in of a one-to-one relation between functional advantage and institutional regimes. That's the historical argument. And the person who is interested in transformation says, and those variations are just a subset of a larger possible realm of variation. That's just another set of controversies. And how do you test those? You test those by experience. So every attempt to establish a new regime is then a bet. Will it work? And that's what these transformations have been. So I don't see any other way of answering your question except by appeal to experience.
Okay, allow me to fully explain
Yes.
where I was coming from.
Yes.
You were pointing out to the fact that if you go down into the legal structure, you are going to find choices that you can't just derive the answer to from some sort of abstract ideal, right?
From inference back to the highest level.
Right.
Yeah.
However, the argument, the argument of a lot of conservatives, and I think of Panglossian neoliberals, is that the reality of the situation, and with our structures, is that we can't know our structures even if they are our creators, because we're not necessarily informed of all aspects of ourselves, and certainly not of other people.
Yes.
There are very often times when we invent things that we don't understand how they work. Our capacities are in fact limited.
Correct.
But when you look historically, we are in fact driving towards some certain types of consensuses around based on pretty fundamental drives that we're not always aware of, and that it is in fact attempting to go to some sort of abstract ideal at all that is incorrect.
Yes, but I don't think that's I interpret that in a different way. I think that's, so a large part of taking the Hayekian example, it's this idea that anarchy is better than command because we have an epistemological limitation, as you suggested. So, but the problem is that the practical or institutional form of anarchy, organized anarchy, is indeterminate. And so what's the organized anarchy? So then in the debate, it would say the economic agent should have the greatest freedom to recombine the factors of production. But the institutional framework of production and exchange within which they recombine the factors of production should be dogmatically fixed, seems to be an arbitrary restraint on the idea of organized anarchy, and to go against the direction of the claim that we don't know. So if we don't know, we should be able to experiment. We should be able to experiment with the framework itself. The market economy should not be fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself. That's the beginning of a different kind of argument. And I think that with respect to the classical liberal ideas, it would serve as the starting point of a distinction between two versions of liberalism. One version would be the classical dogmatic liberalism of the 19th century, which says, we know what the framework of a free order is. There's no dispute about it. And it coincides with the 19th century system of private law. The other version, which to my mind is more plausibly related to the original anarchic experimentalist idea, is that we don't know. And so that we have to continue experimenting with a framework. And that would lead to a different kind of liberalism, which you could call ultra-liberalism. And the distinction between classical liberalism and ultra-liberalism is that classical liberalism dogmatically presupposes the institutional and legal framework, and what I'm calling ultra-liberalism doesn't. And then, and see, the subject I want to discuss later on, the division between the right and the left, then the ultra-liberal sort of becomes on the side of the left. If the institutionally conservative social democrat, who takes the structure for granted, and who in Europe and the rest of the world are regarded as leftists, are then conservatives. And the ultra-liberal, who is interested in this idea of the radicalization of experimentalism, but doesn't assume that it has a prefixed framework, then becomes a leftist. So the cards are shuffled. And that's a debate of remarkable interest in the future of political philosophy. I think that's what the debate is. Now, I mentioned Holmes because Holmes is sort of a transitional figure, because he's not on the side of the market fundamentalism. He doesn't believe in that. But neither does he believe in large alternatives. So what does he believe in? He believes in that there are these conflicts, these indeterminacies, and that they're resolved in circumstance, in context, in the moment, by ad hoc conflicts of vision and of interest. So that's a third position. And I think that's a way of beginning to approach this very interesting subject that you raised. And that's where we stand. But in the end, everything depends on this dialogue between general ideas and what really happens. And on our reading of history, and on the bets that we place about the possible transformations. Now, second set of ideas. I'm going to deal with as briefly as I can, which are the ideas about agency. And they arise immediately from the ideas about structure. So by agency, I mean the relation of the programmatic proposals, the substantive institutional or structural programmatic proposals, to our ideas about their base, that is to say, the political and social alliances that can sustain them and implement them. So let's begin with the practical predicament of the leftists, going back to discussion at the very beginning of the course. The historical constituency of the left parties in the late 19th and early 20th century was the organized industrial labor class, labor force, headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, especially in mechanized manufacturing or for this mass production. That was the core constituency. And what has happened generally, given the transformation of the paradigms of production, is that this core constituency has ceased to be a plausible representative of the universal interests of society or of the working class, and has increasingly come to be seen, and ultimately even to see itself as just one more special interest, with sectarian interests. So they're a minority in the labor force. And they're a minority with interests that, at the surface at least, are in contradiction to the interests of the majority, which is a majority of workers in undercapitalized shops small and medium-sized businesses in the economy, or even in precarious employment. That's the majority. So if the left parties tie their fate to this minority, they're sort of sinking with them into this narrower and narrower faction that has insular interests. But then it seems that the alternative to that is to cut this privileged connection to the organized labor force, and then they're unmoored. And then what are they? It's just a generic quality of life party with no connections to particular parts of the social structure. That's how they experience the dilemma. And what in general would be necessary on one interpretation of the problem is that they would seek to have a larger view of the base. The base would be an alliance of the interests of work and production against, for example, the interests of rentiers. If we now take as the definition, a broader definition of rentiers, not just financial rentiers, living off of coupons of interest, but all those who are dependent on the extraction of value without productive contribution. And so the idea of the base, of the majority of the interests of production and of labor is, as it were, just the reverse side of the programmatic proposals. Like the notion, for example, of a deepened and disseminated knowledge economy is the proposal of a productivist project that seeks to involve the majority in a more advanced practice of production. And it's an unaccomplished task. So it's unaccomplished now, both on the programmatic side and on the strategic side, the formation of this base. Now, the next thing I want to say is this, to restate an idea I suggested in last week's class, which is that the views about agency that we need are, at least in one important respect, the opposite of the Marxist views. It's not just that they're different, they're the inverse. So a fundamental aspect of the Marxist view of agency is that there are objective class interests. Each mode of production has a characteristic class structure, and therefore a characteristic structure of class conflict, and each class in that structure has definite interests that play a predetermined role in the script of class conflict as the mechanism for the transformation of the modes of production. The event, the crisis of one and its substitution by another mode of production. Feudalism by capitalism, capitalism by socialism. So then the view, the assumption in Marxist theory, is that the more class conflict escalates in scope and in intensity, the more patent the objective content of class interest becomes. If politics are stagnant, there's a confusion about the class interest. If politics becomes more radical, the class conflict becomes more severe, the substance of the class interest becomes more patent. Now, I want to claim that this view is exactly the opposite of the truth. That the assumption that class interests have an objective predetermined content depends on relative stagnation. And that as conflict escalates, in scope and in intensity, the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class or a certain fraction of the labor force, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the alternatives in the realm of the adjacent possible? And who would I become under each of those alternatives? And what would my interests and even my identity then be? So it's the opposite, that as conflict, as class conflict escalates, the question about the content of the interest becomes less and less separable from the question about the alternatives. What are the feasible and desirable alternatives? And who do I become under those alternatives? And how are the relations among classes redefined under those alternatives? How are the classes reshaped? For example, the relation of the organized labor force to the temporary precarious workers on one side or to the small business class on the other is different, is reshaped if there's movement in the direction of what I call the deepened and disseminated market economy. So then there are three ideas about agency, three theses that would unpack this conception that I'm saying is the inverse of the Marxist conception. So the first is what you call the correspondence thesis. So the correspondence thesis is that every project of transformation can and should be formulated in two equivalent registers. One register is as a set of structural or institutional proposals. And the other register is as the construction of a base, which is both a political and a social base. And we tend to think of the second as if it were an afterthought or an instrument of the first, but it's really not that way. The same conception can be, should be translated into these two languages. And they're equivalents of each other. They don't have just an instrumental relation. That's the correspondence thesis. Now comes a thesis which is more controversial than that thesis, which is, let me call it the asymmetry thesis. So the asymmetry thesis is that a political alliance, an alliance of transformative forces with a transformative project, does not presuppose an antecedent class alliance, because it has the construction of that class alliance as its task. Of course, in order to implement that task, it has to come to terms with the classes that exist and how people now understand their interests. But every powerful transformative project, like for example, Roosevelt's New Deal, develops its own base as it goes along. Or the nationalist populist dictators in Latin America, like Vargas, or populist leaders, Cardenas, Perón. These projects developed their own base. The state helped create the organized industrial labor force, the labor law regime that would provide a device of controlled popular mobilization. It constructed its base. No powerful transformative project in history simply relies on an antecedent base. But to construct a new base, it has to build with the materials that history provides it with. So a political alliance does not presuppose a class alliance. But a class alliance does presuppose a political alliance, because it has to be developed over time. It has to be politically constructed. There are no natural class lines on this view. And that's the asymmetry thesis. Now, the asymmetry thesis might seem counterintuitive to you, but just think about it. If something like the asymmetry thesis were not true, how could transformation ever happen? Because the world is organized to reproduce itself. And so if there's a discontinuity in the reproduction of the world, it must be because something like or some part of this asymmetry thesis is true. Now comes the third thesis. And the third thesis is the thesis of greatest practical importance. The third thesis is the duality thesis, which I referred to earlier in the arguments of the course. But you can now see it in its larger theoretical context. The duality thesis is that there are always two families of ways of defining and defending a class interest or a group interest. There is one way that is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive, and there's another way that is socially solidaristic and institutionally transformative. So, of course, these are just directions, relative directions. It's not an absolute contrast. So, I go back to the canonical example for the left, which is the example of the way of understanding and defending the interests of the organized labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, especially in mass production. So now mass production is in crisis. Mass production is declining in all the rich North Atlantic economies. So one way of defining and defending the interests of the organized workers in what the Americans call the Rust Belt, the declining mass production industry, is to say, we'll dig ourselves into this trench, into this niche, and we'll take a series of defensive actions against offshoring, in favor of protectionism, against migratory flows, in favor of subsidies. And it may be that this declining form of mass production has no future, but it's what we have. And so we're, at the very least, we'll buy a few more years for it. And in that orientation, which is then institutionally conservative, structurally conservative, the groups that are closest in the social and economic space to the defended group are the enemies. The small business class, the temporary workers, the foreign workers, and so forth. Because that's the whole logic of the niche. You defend the niche against all comers and against all threats. So that's one way of defining and defending a group interest. But there's always another way of defining and defending a group interest, or class interest, which is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. So you say, this project, giving the example, this project of buying a few more years for mass production is hopeless, has no future. Mass production has no future, its fate is sealed. In order to have a future, we have to convert it into something else. We have to convert it into a form of the knowledge economy. And in that project, so institutionally transformative, and requiring a whole set of new arrangements between firms and the state, with public investment related to private investment and so forth. And in that project of converting mass production into something else, some of the groups that we used to consider our enemies must become our allies. The small business class, the temporary workers, and so forth. That's the fundamental duality in the way of defining and defending class interests. And the duality is confounding, perplexing, and troubling because of this obvious fact that the institutionally conservative and socially exclusive approach to the definition and defense of the class interest has an immense advantage. It's tangible. So that's what I said before. So you say to the union leader or the politician with this base, develop this project of converting mass production into this other thing. And he'll answer you saying, you want me to jeopardize my base before I have another base. And I'll be left with nothing. So this project that you're speaking about goes on in historical time, but I don't live in historical time. I live in biographical time. So there's what the economists call a principal-agent problem. The principal are the people, the agent is the politician or the union leader, and the union leader cares about what's going to happen to him if he jeopardizes his own base before he has another one. That's the problem on that side. But it has no future. So somehow this imbalance has to be corrected. And the potential of the alternative, the risky alternative, the bet, as we were calling it earlier in the conversation, has to somehow be brought to present value. It has to be translated into something that is not only meaningful now, but useful now. Otherwise, it won't count. And so there has to be this, somehow this confluence of imagination and practical ingenuity in finding these down payments that create the intermediate links between the here and the there. And that's the great work of practical transformation, which has to somehow combine the practical and the prophetic. So these three theses that I've cited, the correspondence thesis, the asymmetry thesis, and the duality thesis, define the contours of a different way of thinking about agency, which is immediately related to the earlier ideas about structure. And that's another example of how we can begin to develop a way of thinking that does not take the exclusive form of a comprehensive and dogmatic social theory. Because this isn't a comprehensive and dogmatic theory, but it is, these ideas do form some of the elements of a way of thinking. And the way of thinking has large practical consequences for how we approach the problems of controversy in these contemporary debates. So I guess the first question is questions of clarity, of clarification, and then, of course, the substance, the merit of these views. You know what the characteristic mentality is. The mentality is, if I state the Marxist view of agency, almost no one will defend it. But does that mean that they believe in the alternative? No, they don't believe in that either. So it's this confusion in which we're in this state of suspended animation, in which we don't believe in the premises of the classical progressive or leftist ideas, but neither do we see any clear alternative to them. So what's the compromise that happens, in fact, is we continue to use the vocabulary of the ideas in which we no longer believe. And the vocabulary then casts a spell, it misleads us. It's a form of self-deception in which we pretend to have a view that we don't have. And that's incompatible with transformation. So that's a luxury that those who want the world to reproduce itself can allow themselves, but not those who are out to change it. They need clarity. Yes?
I have the feeling that some type of agency is back in a way distorted. And I think it's reflected in this surge of far-right populist leaders in which we have this archetype of the Messiah, the leader who
Yes.
is beyond the structures and has the capacity to shake the system and
Populism in the
Europe.
European sense, you mean?
Also in the US or in Latin America.
No, well, but because populism in the United States meant something else. Populism in the United States meant someone who defends the interests of the people. And of course, he had to be a person who was not dogmatic, but that was the old American meaning of populism.
If it helps, we can take out the word community.
No, I think it's very interesting because the American elites, as I mentioned, have now imported the European meaning of populism, and it's a remarkable development that their anxiety should have reached the point that they allowed the Europeans to define the meaning of their words. But this is the old American idea of populism was just that. You know, Tip O'Neill told me, Speaker of the House of Representatives, defining himself, that I'm a populist. So that's how the American politicians spoke. Huh? But the European meaning is this invidious meaning in which populism connotes two things in the fancy European meaning now imported into the United States. So one is it's extra or anti-institutional action, personalist, strongman, and so forth. Caesarism would be the technical term in the history of political thought. That's the first connotation. The second connotation, which is closely related to the first, is that it's a kind of trickery, a demagoguery, because he's promising a shortcut that doesn't really exist. And the characteristic of the shortcut is that it's a circumvention of some structural change that would make it real. Now, what's interesting is that the institutionally conservative social democrats, the supposed enemies of the populace in the European sense, aren't populist in the first sense of anti-institutional, but they are also populist in the second sense, because they too have no structural proposals. They don't have any structural proposals. And if you look at some of the details of their political economy, they're remarkably convergent with the political economy of the populace. Defend declining mass production. They don't go for restraints on migratory flows often, but they do want subsidies, they do want protection, and so forth. So it's the same thing. In that respect, there's an overlap, which is this evasion of structure. So what you could say is that populism, in this European sense, is a kind of liquefaction. It's an interlude. That is, the centrist, neoliberal, institutionally conservative, social democratic dispensation fails, and it fails to respond to the needs and interests of an increasing part of the working class population. They're discontented. They break with this centrist consensus, and that then creates the opportunity for the populace. But the populace characteristically doesn't have a real institutional or structural program. Not even a constitutional program, just strengthening of executive authority. Political economy is nothing. It's a set of defensive measures. So it's this interlude, it's this vacuum in which the hegemony of the institutionally conservative social democracy and neoliberalism is suspended or broken or compromised. But the alternative that is created is a kind of floating alternative with very little substance. The power of a political project resides in its institutional legacy. Without an institutional legacy, it's nothing. It's ephemeral. And so the populism would maintain this opportunity for the progressives if they had a project, which for the most part, they don't. So that's how I would see the relation of populism to these debates. So we do have one final set of ideas to explore, which are regarding the ideal and how to understand and reinterpret the relation of the left to the right from the standpoint of these ideas. So again, let me go back to the very beginning of the course, to the very first class. I'll have to be very summary in my treatment. The conventional ideological debate, not just in the North Atlantic world, but throughout the world, is a debate that you could describe as shallow freedom against shallow equality. So who's the right? The right are those who give priority to freedom against the background of the established institutional arrangements. And who's the left? The left are those who give priority to equality against the background of those same arrangements. So what shallowness means in this contrast is acceptance of the framework, because there's no alternative to it, or no feasible, no desirable alternative. And it's simply a question of balancing freedom and equality. And that's loosely related to the balance between market and state. Now take the theories of justice that are predominant in the Anglo-American Academy for the last few decades, theories of distributive justice. They are a kind of philosophical gloss, an ex post commentary on the institutionally conservative social democratic position. So they seem to be radically egalitarian because a supreme object is, for example, the promotion of the needs of the most needy, and equality is the highest. But the whole argument is in fact devoted to a kind of pseudo-philosophical justification of the homely practices of compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer in the late 20th century social democratic state. That's what it's all about. What are the principles that justify more or less progressive taxation, more or less redistributive social entitlement? Nothing about structure. And nothing about the institutional arrangements that shape the fundamental distribution of advantage. And if you consider that to be the chief topic, you wouldn't adopt this whole way of thinking. You would think in a completely different way. And your thought would all be directed to the reimagination and reshaping of the structure, not to these principles of retrospective correction of the inequalities generated in the market. Now, what would it mean to escape the restraint of shallowness? To lift that condition. So you wouldn't accept the institutional background. Then what would the leftist want? Would he want what you could call deep equality? So by deep equality, I mean a far-reaching equality of outcome or of circumstance. So you would have a relentless redistributive mechanism that would say, the market generates inequalities. Now we'll cancel all those inequalities out. So it does one thing, after the fact we'll correct it. So the tax rates will be, the higher marginal rates will be over 90%. There'll be restraints on alienation. There'll be restraints on size, and so on and so forth. Now, here's the problem. It seems no one wants that. So that's like the myth of ancient Sparta, fantasy of Rome, agrarian reform with radical limits on alienation and accumulation. It's a fantasy. It's not something for real. Although it's a fantasy that is often linked to the so-called radical Republican idea of the selfless citizen and so forth. The Spartan, the free Spartan, living alongside a population of slaves or helots, but free and equally poor and austere among themselves. No one wants that in the world, except maybe a tiny faction of academics somewhere. But it's not something that has any appeal to any significant part of humanity. And it was never the project of the liberals and socialists, of the left in the earlier historical period, before this new kind of diminished leftism. So the diminished leftism has as its goal to give priority to equality. But the methodological presupposition is the acceptance of the structure. So if you combine the egalitarian commitment with the acceptance of the structure, the pragmatic residue is the orientation to compensatory and retrospective redistribution by tax and transfer. That's what it means to combine those two things. And that's the object of these theories of distributive justice in the Anglo-American world. They have no structural content, no structural ambition. The fundamental model of liberal and leftist thinking in the 19th century was completely different. The fundamental objective was a larger life for the ordinary man and woman, with more capacity, more intensity, more scope. There was a struggle against inequality, but inequality was subsidiary, the struggle for inequality, to this larger objective, because an entrenched and extreme inequality would be incompatible with this empowerment of the ordinary individual and the ascent to a higher form of life. And it was crucial to that vision that this bigness would be shared. So as opposed to the idea of the strong, the genius, the leader, standing above the weak herd, the message was, let's become bigger together. Be a form of shared empowerment. That was the goal. That was the central goal. Now, that goal was defective in its formulation because the model, the template for its expression was a narrow aristocratic idea of self-possession. So the model was like in Tocqueville, the aristocrat under the Ancien Regime, on his land, a little lord. And that was the idea of empowerment. And the method for the prosecution of this ideal was structural change, meaning change in the institutional arrangements. And especially the institutional arrangements of the private order. And each faction had its dogma, its blueprint. So the liberals said, here's the system of private rights. Adopt it and you will be both free and prosperous. And the socialists said, no, we'll have this other system. Equally dogmatic, equally a blueprint. And so we can no longer believe in these blueprints. It's a fundamental theme in our situation. So this is one of the central ideas here that I've been trying to explore, that we must recognize the primacy of structural change, but we are demanded by our experience, by history, not to succumb to a structural dogmatism. And therefore, we have a problem, a task, without historical precedent. How can we affirm the primacy of structural change without succumbing to the structural dogmatism? One of the implications is that our institutional arrangements in the economy and in politics must have this quality of facilitating their own revision in the light of experience, of opening themselves up to their own transformation. so that we don't, so there isn't some kind of Lycurgus who comes and says, this is the system. Now you just live under it and you'll be free. No, it has to be an organization of the path that will continue. And so that we'll be able to engage without surrendering. Now then, from this argument, we would say, we have to reject the institutionally conservative social democracy, and we can use the earlier 19th century example, not to copy it, to reproduce it mechanically, but as an inspiration. What is the fundamental objective? Reinterpret it. The fundamental objective is the enhancement of agency. The capacity of the agent to act in the context, beyond the context, and against the context. That's freedom, that's power. And it's related to our moral and material interests. And to be real, the leftists would say, the progressives, it must be shared. We must become bigger together. Not by the contrast of the heroic individual to the weak herd. And the method must be a form of structural change that is fragmentary, but that persists. And that above all has this characteristic of helping to organize its own revision in the light of experience. It is the organization of experimentalism in the service of empowerment. And this idea of the enhancement of agency has as its complement a conception of the higher forms of cooperation. Because the two functional imperatives of the advanced societies are the enhancement of agency, the capable agent, and the higher forms of cooperation. Now, what are these higher forms of cooperation, as illustrated in economic life? That there not be an entrenched scheme of social division and hierarchy that impose on each of us a script saying, depending on our place in the social order, we can only cooperate this way or that way. The form of cooperation, including in the market order, must not be fastened to a single version of itself. We must be able to experiment with alternative forms of decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities. The individual must be secure in a haven of vital protected immunities and endowments so that he be unafraid and capable. But not because protection is an end in itself, because it's the condition to throw social life open to a radical plasticity. No individual should be condemned to do the work that can be done by a machine. Repetitious, formulaic work. The individual is the anti-machine. And free labor should increasingly evolve towards its higher forms, self-employment and cooperation, and not its defective servile form, economically dependent wage labor. So the conception of the higher forms of cooperation is the complement to this idea of the enhancement of agency. And the ability to cooperate and the enhancement of agency are the two fundamental functional requirements of the advanced societies on this view. And the method is this method of structural change without structural dogmatism. Now, from this there results a different conception of the division between right and left. So what are the fundamental differential markers? So who is right under this view? A simple formula would be to say, in the first instance, the right are those who accept some barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional arrangements of the market and of politics. Like, for example, the now hegemonic project in the North Atlantic world of flexibilizing social democracy, as opposed to embarking on a project of cumulative change of the institutional arrangements. On the other dimension of the goal, the right are those who believe that littleness is natural. So there are a few exceptional individuals, but everyone else is little and more or less naturally condemned to live a prosaic small life. And that's natural. Not to think that way is to be a romantic. So that's the spiritual idea. And ideas are mystifications, fantasies about alternatives. That's the criterion. Those are the criteria for the distinction between right and left on this view. And some who are now on the right on this view would be in the left. But the great majority of all the political forces would be on the right, on this or under this classification, including those who regard themselves as social democrats or progressives in their majority. So, the opportunity or a problem, I'm not sure. But it seems to me to be an implication of this argument. It goes in this direction. And of course, the central question is, who are we? What can we become? What is the level of our ambition for ourselves? Politics, when it's serious, it has this religious element. It's about us, our vocation, and the relation of that vocation to historical experience. But that, of course, is speaking from the vantage point of what I'm calling the left. Because the standpoint of what I'm calling the right is that politics is no place for the sublime. The sublime should be privatized. Politics is the realm of cold, marginal efficiencies and equities. And the sublime is for religion, for art, for domesticity, for intimate experience. So this vision of the left is incompatible with the idea of the privatization of the sublime. It's another idea. Now, take the United States as an example of the confusions and contradictions in the world about this problem. So on one side, in their official political life and in most of their political discourse, the Americans, the American leaders, the political forces are overwhelmingly on the side of the right, as I've just defined it. But their religious and spiritual life, historically, has been the opposite. Because the message of the American prophets, Emerson, Whitman, Lincoln, is this message of the individual as having has his vocation to increase his part in the divine attribute of transcendence. That the ordinary man and woman, seen more closely, is not so ordinary after all. And although there are in the United States the same religious factions that exist in the other advanced societies, the secular humanists, skeptics, humanizers on one side, and the more or less orthodox believers in the Semitic monotheisms on the other side, there's also a third element, which is the distinctively original contribution of the United States to the religious life of humanity, which is what Harold Bloom called the Gnostic religion. That the individual is the uncreated divine spark, directly related to the divine. And those are the characteristic religious inventions of the American people. Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, Christian Science, and so forth. So there's this other idea that exists in the United States that is in some conflict with the dominant temper of political life. And in every country in the world, in a different form, we will find the similar contradictions. And those contradictions are for the challenger, the transformer, the enemy of the established order, the opportunity, the knock on the door. So this is all by way of introduction to our last class, which will be solely devoted to conversation. And we will begin with the vexed question of identity politics. And I will begin the class by stating the reasons for which I oppose it. So we'll talk next week. Tudo bem?
O Brasil está caótico.
Sim.
É uma coisa fora de controle. A pessoa não estou muito confiante e eu tenho muita essa preocupação com o senhor, sabiamente, quando na última vez que nós falamos do Chile, não perdeu o timing do engajamento na política brasileira. O senhor não precisa responder, mas se o senhor fosse engajar em algum plano da política progressista no Brasil agora, é difícil para um garoto, eu, sei lá, de hoje, o senhor tem uma...
Trabalhe comigo.
Mas no Brasil?
No Brasil, eu quero desenvolver um projeto político no Brasil.
Professor, seria uma honra enorme. Eu só preciso do senhor.
Nós estamos tentando estabelecer
Caio comentou comigo.
os instrumentos dessa política. Mas eu quero ter uma saúde. E eu considero que eu não posso ter, não posso ter